Hey, good morning, y'all. Trace Johannesson here. Thank you for joining us on your lunch hour on a Tuesday. We're going to talk a little bit about education, the state of our education system in the U.S., and the importance of trades and skilled labor. I've got with me Mr. Matt Nayland to join in the conversation today. So,
Treasurer extraordinaire.
He's a man of many talents, not just a treasurer. He's a Renaissance man and a well-read American. So anyway, let's jump into it. Why do we even have education? What's the purpose of higher education? And I don't mean just university, but any education. I tend to believe that it's a good way to provide a foundation for a means through life, right? So especially as it pertains to skills, it's a good way to learn job skills, and you can provide for your family and be a productive member of society. There's an element of foundational education that's important, reading and writing and basic arithmetic, I think. But I believe strongly that our society has created a system by which we have shown our students that the only way to be successful in life is by pursuing a 4-year college degree. And we'll talk a little bit about why I think that's a mistake and why we need to kind of tap the brakes on that. Matt, what do you think about the higher education and what role it should serve?
Well, I mean, I look at the historical purpose for it, which was to essentially try and ensure there was an elevated education for people who were going into specific areas. You had laws being one, you had medicine being another. And I think then, especially after World War II, you had a big focus on science and engineering, and they became the bedrock and really became the world-class leaders in science, engineering, and some of the higher education with the purpose of technological progress and pursuit of greater intellect abilities. And you had a liberal arts degree that was really focused at one point on critical thinking. That is severely changed after the postmodernists got in charge in the 1970s. But at first, it was really focused on critical thinking. And that's something that, unfortunately, I think we could say anecdotally, but maybe there's more stronger statistics that show that's declined dramatically.
I think that's exactly right. There are a couple of things you hit on there. The critical thinking thing, I couldn't agree with more. Like, I like the idea of teaching critical thinking and creative problem solving. And I wish we had more of that in our lower schools, like primary and secondary schools. But the other thing you mentioned about the point of a higher education, it is important when you know that there's a higher skilled path that you are going to pursue in life as a young person. I didn't have that knowledge and understanding when I started college, 18, but some people do. And you mentioned a couple, like practicing law or perhaps accounting or a legal career. And if you know by the time that you're 18 years old that that's the next step you want to try in life, that's great. I don't think that the majority of students at 18, 17 years old feel confident in what they want their next step to be. And for that reason, I think that, well, let's just kind of talk a little bit about.
No, I agree with you. I think that's a critical mistake, and where we kind of foist this huge debt on an 18-year-old with kind of an assumption that they have some chosen career path that they're going to be able to discover themselves in college. I mean, unfortunately, that's just not the case. It hasn't been for me. It took many years to come to a conclusion as to what I really wanted to do.
Boy.
And yeah, I mean, some people know exactly what they want to do. 5 years old, they want to be a veterinarian, and in the rare occasion, they actually become a veterinarian.
And good for them. Certainly
right.
Not our path through life, right?
Yeah, but most people don't have enough exposure, to the world outside of their community to really have a real appreciation of what exactly they want to do.
Exposure is a really good word, and it's a topic that I'm going to bring up towards the end. So put a pin in that word.
Put a pin. You got it.
I want to circle back a little bit to what you mentioned about making kind of the university education accessible or encouraging it. And the topic I want to kind of talk about is the government-backed student loans, right? And should the government be in the student loan business? And I think the answer is a resounding no. And I'll tell you why. First of all, if we look at the results, okay, what the government being in the business does is it creates an incentive for the average student with the promise or the theory of safe or cheap money, right? It's easy to borrow. It's backed by the federal government. So there's less of a hesitation to shoulder that debt, because the thought process, right, or the narrative that we've told in our society is that all you have to do is get a 4-year degree and you'll be successful. That may have been true in the 70s, 80s, and 90s when having a college degree was a differentiator. Ironically, I think that had to do with because with a system of money or a loan system where it's not so easy and not so cheap and not so affordable, the folks that we talked about who knew their paths through life would be willing to take on the risk or work extra hard to pursue that degree. And so what we saw was money was harder to get. It was a little more expensive, or it could be that folks who could afford it would go. But also, you have more of a disincentive to go ahead and spend that kind of money for a 4-year degree. And what we've seen over the last 20 years is that the price or the cost of a 4-year degree has tripled the rate of inflation, because we've got the demand that's going up based on the government-backed money. We've got a supply that's probably not growing as fast as the population. And by supply, I mean the number of higher education institutions, although with these incentives, they are popping up as for-profit universities. It's a very, very lucrative business, kind of like the mortgage-backed business. If you can get in it and have the government guarantee the debt, it makes it a pretty lucrative possibility. So with the increased demand, so a bunch of students, and the pressure through society, think about this. Moms and dads where we live say, "Oh, where's your kid going to go to school next year? Where are they going to college?" Or where did you go to college? Right? Like that's the first question that they always ask, is if that's some kind of big defining part of your life, where you went to university for 4 to 5, or in my case, almost 6 years spread out. But the problem is that now we see that 40% of students who pursue bachelor's degrees don't graduate in 6 years. So 40%, and that's from the National Center for Educational Statistics. So that percentage, by the way, the 40% who don't graduate, it's much higher at these for-profit schools. Yeah. So we have all of this. We have 1.4 trillion in outstanding student loan debt right now. And what do you think that's going to do to our economy?
It's already playing out in our economy, right? I mean, when you look at, again, like all things, when the federal government decides to insert itself, it typically is only focused on one outcome and does not consider all of the unintended consequences that have long-term negative effects, whether it's affordable housing or healthcare, or in this case, higher ed. So they came in and they said, okay, hey, what we want to do is we want to make higher education attainable by everybody, just like they did with houses. We want to make houses, single-family homes, attainable by everybody. That's the outcome. So then they say, oh, well, how do we do that? Okay, well, we will provide a bunch of government-backed loans. But when we provide you those government-backed loans, it's specifically to student loans, we're also eventually, I think it was in the 2000s, we're also going to make them non-dischargeable in a bankruptcy. Meaning, you get your basket weaving degree, or you get your degree in feminist studies of ancient Rome, and then you turn out
non-marketable degrees, right? Right. Degrees which is not a high demand of that skill.
Exactly. And so they insert themselves and they create a non-free market that would come with supply and demand, as being like, what's the value of your education? Well, that's going to that's going to be determined in the marketplace of the economy. They come in with a student government-backed loans, right, that you cannot discharge, meaning the schools themselves are just printing money because they are saddling students with these higher, and like you quoted already, tuition that is well above inflation, knowing that there are lenders out there that are going to continue to lend because those lenders know that the person who gets some BS degree can't discharge it in bankruptcy, so that lender doesn't lose any money. They're holding that boot to the throat all the way through, which means the universities themselves will continue to support these ridiculous degrees, get students into those ridiculous degrees, and then transfer the long-term wealth of 18 to 22-year-olds from their long-term earning potential has now been transferred to a bunch of middle-aged bureaucrats within the university system or professors who are essentially having their wages continue to go up because of this government intervention.
So let me get this straight.
Clearly, it makes me upset.
We have another example of good intended government who artificially manipulates markets and has this crazy level of unintended consequences, which results in this student loan debt, which is backed by the government, cannot be disposed of or dealt with in bankruptcy like many other debts, which means for a lender, it's low risk for them. So it's a no-brainer, all because the government kind of stepped in. I think that kind of just underscores the fact that
and then on your sorry, you know, I get charged up on this.
Yeah, go ahead.
People on the left, what they decided to say is, okay, well, now let's just forgive all student loans. And guess who are the people who are paying for that? Oh. People who have already paid off their student loans, or people who never went to college in the first place. Now, society, you've basically socialized everybody's bad decisions that started with the government in the first place. So if you got your grievance degree in some you know, ridiculous kind of, you know, studies that says America's bad, and you come out and you find out, oh, the marketplace doesn't value that, well, then we now are saying all taxpayers now have to pay for that free college. There is no such thing as free college. There's no such thing as free healthcare.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So you just brought up a really good point I want to underscore. A government-created problem. Now people in the government are trying to socialize that and make everyone else pay for that. Not only does that that kind of socialization an egregious overreach, but it also shows by our emotions, by our actions to young people that if you give your word to a debt or an obligation, you don't have to honor it. We will take care of it for you. How is that teaching our young people individual responsibility? It's the antithesis of individual responsibility and kind of what the government, what our country was founded on. So it's shocking to me that's the mindset, and it's okay as if forgiving student loans is some kind of appropriate answer, and it made some kind of good sense. I mean, it's a selfish thing. It might be a thing that somebody with a lot of student loans wants, but just because somebody wants something doesn't mean it's the right thing for that person or for society. If we just gave everyone what they wanted, take your kids, for example, they'd have ice cream for every meal because that's what they want. And they all voted. We have more kids than we have parents in our house, but that's not the right thing. We know that from our experience and our life experience. It's a terrible, terrible idea.
And the pursuit of higher education is in and of itself not a bad thing. It's a glorious thing, and it should be celebrated. I mean, we all want to have a pursuit of knowledge, and the research institutions have been extraordinarily valuable to this country. The specific instance that we're talking about is, one, the societal pressure, like I think you've brought up, the societal pressure to say that everybody needs it. No, that's not true, because, you know, different strokes for different folks. And the saddling of massive debt onto students who then have no clear understanding of the long-term ramifications, negative ramifications on their family, their economic well-being. And that part is insidious, and that part, I think, is highly destructive to society.
No, I couldn't agree more. And you mentioned something earlier that kind of made me think about this topic, and that was kind of feeding these students these liberal arts degrees, and kind of, it's almost like there's an indoctrination. And I'm not sure if everyone's aware, but some studies have indicated that the very liberal or progressive or left-leaning professors outnumber more conservative ones about 6 to 1, just kind of in general. And that's obviously would shift probably on the coastal schools. You'll have a much higher ratio than that. In places like Texas A&M, where I went to school, the ratio is probably much more balanced, if not more conservative. But the point being, again, that they're being oftentimes told these ideas about America or the American experiment they're slanted. And I'm not saying that they're necessarily trying to teach Marxist or communist ideas. I don't think it's anything that insidious. But the core fundamental problem with any of the liberal or left or progressive agenda is that there isn't really a plank that has a limiting factor or defining characteristic, or, hey, we achieved this objective, we're good. It's all about continuing to move down a continuum. And so when students are taught in schools, we're hearing stories that they're taught that America is somehow bad and evil, like an evil empire. There's a disproportionate focus on a lot of things about our history that's extremely negative, and less focus on the rugged individualism and pioneer spirit that defined our country and has created the amazing economy, the amazing world power, the amazing inventions, the amazing society that we haven't seen. And there's a negative focus, a disproportionate negative focus. For example, some might say, well, America was founded on slavery. Okay, well, yeah, we did have a dark chapter in our past, and slavery was a big part of that. I think that there's a discussion that says the Civil War was about slaves, and ergo, anyone who fought in the Confederate States is a racist slave owner. Okay, well, there's a lot of mental leaps you have to go through to get to that. So let's just kind of roll that back a little bit. I think you mentioned to me earlier, did America invent slavery, Matt, or was that something that's been around forever?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great line, and I wish it was mine, but I did take it from somewhere, and I just don't know where to attribute it. But Western civilization in the United States didn't invent slavery, but we did abolish it. I mean, that's what's happened throughout North America and Europe. And
I think we're the fifth country in the world to abolish slavery, right?
Yes. Yeah, and it doesn't negate the fact that there's racial troubles that have been around since well, frankly, if we're going to be honest about it, been around for all of mankind. I mean, right. There's a certain innate tribalism to every society, and there always has been. And
it's a safety thing, right? The tribalism where we look like each other, and I don't know about the others. I don't know. So there's a caution element that's a survival instinct that goes back to, there's some anthropology there that I'm not super smart on, but you're definitely hitting on something. The other part that is interesting to me is, let's think about the South and what it looked like. You had plantation owners who were wealthy, who had slaves. Was it only the wealthy slave owners who picked up a rifle to fight against the North in the Civil War?
No, I mean, of course not. I mean, you were compelled, if you were of a certain age, to join your state in order to fight against, the Union, and vice versa. And oh, by the way, there was a bunch of Irish people who got off of a boat in New York and then were suddenly conscripted to go fight against the Confederates. And they were like, okay. I mean, if there is a redistribution of wealth based on reparations, then there's a whole bunch of people of Irish descent who landed here, had no slaves, but were the fundamental, cannon fodder that ended up helping to free them. So, how are you going to divvy that out? That's a problem, though. If you go back to, because I don't want to get us too far off, but if you go back to the initial idea of critical thinking, that's absent. And the big absence is context, historical context. And where we're at today is vastly different than where we were at 100 years ago. But yet, we don't want to have grace or understanding that, people in their time and place had very different mentalities. But that was, go ahead.
And they didn't know any better in some regards, right? Like it's super important to take
from which they came from.
Right.
I mean, if you go through and you talk about different atrocities that we want to attribute, I mean, is anybody going to go to the Comanches and start asking for, repayment to the Apaches when they slaughtered them and drove them out of most of the northern plains? Probably not.
Probably not.
I mean, it's just you go down these silly thought experiments that though scarily get rooted into society because you have this like, oh, what is your truth versus critical thinking of what is the truth? What are the factual circumstances? And again, it doesn't negate any of the historical, sins, but what it does say is that we should probably be able to absolve them as we progress and become a more, free and equal society. But that's been the aim of the United States, and that should be given a lot of credit.
Better, right?
Yeah, that's the joy and the great thing that separates us from every other country.
Totally agreed. And it is, again, I want to reiterate what you're saying, but we're not saying that we didn't have a checkered or a dark past, because we do, but we need to recognize it for what it is and put it in context and have a little nuance and a little thoughtful discussion. And not, this is not a black and white world. Like, it's not a binary on or off. It's a continuum. It's shades of gray. There's a lot of things that are different back then. And if we can't have an honest, just rational discussion about it, I think that's a miss. And I want to go back thematically just to the general theme, indoctrination. Again, I don't think it's appropriate that we're teaching young Americans that America is bad because of a few mistakes we made, big mistakes, right? But we shouldn't, to your point, we didn't invent, for example, slavery, one of the biggest black marks in our American history. But we fixed it, and we were one of the first countries to abolish it, and that wasn't that long ago. But to your point, I think that America is trying to get better, and let's just be. How about we focus on the good? Like, let's not dwell on all the negative, and that's kind of what I want to get to.
I think it's fully appropriate to explore the areas of which we weren't a perfectly just or far from it society. I mean, I think that also needs to be taken into consideration, but it's not it doesn't define the United States. And that's the thing that I think we've gotten away from is there used to be a clear understanding. Maybe there was some whitewashing before too, probably, but we've gotten away from critical thinking and nuance and understanding the historical context that we all derive from.
I totally agree with you.
For good or evil. Yeah.
What's that?
For good or evil. So this binary, quick Twitter, it's not the way that universities should be taught. But instead, what's happened is that the foxes have taken over the chicken coop or the hen hound, because you'll have young people who get their emotions inflamed through social media, and they'll get stoked by a certain population of the professors who have that mindset and agenda. And then that is going to be the way in which they then help silence other people who want to talk and have critical discussions, because they know that they can have ramifications. So that free speech is critical thinking.
Absolutely agreed.
If you can't do that on a university, then you start wondering, well, what really is the point? How are you going to explore knowledge? And when that moves over into other hard sciences, I mean, it's one thing if you're in the humanities, but when you start dictating how science is pursued by a political agenda, you're starting to defeat the entire reason that you have a university in the first place.
That's absolutely right. When you're starting to dictate what science or history looks like based on an agenda, then that's definitely a slippery slope. Chris Holt says, this narrative is not accurate in the least. There are much more nefarious reasons for the continued push by many to cut education. I think he commented back when we were talking about education. I'm not sure if he's referring to cutting education. My thought process in terms of cutting education is being smarter about it. The Department of Education was initially founded in a very limited capacity back in the 1800s, and it was heavily pushed back on by the states at the time because they thought it was a governmental overreach. My particular discussion here was more about the student loan program, and I'm not entirely convinced that the student loan program is as good as it may have been at one time, and it's caused unintended consequences, which we talked through. So, I mean, cutting education sounds like a binary way to paint something as bad. I don't think that it's cutting education. I think in my mind, it's let's remove the incentive created by the government to go and jump into and waste time and money on something for which there's not a very clear outcome. Specifically, what I mean is for Trace to go straight to college without a pretty clear outcome and understanding.
Well, define cutting education by also what are other educational alternatives. So
right.
Let's say you wanted to pursue some sort of career in real estate. There are CCIM. There's another thing called Adventures in Commercial Real Estate that I'm doing, that I'm paying for. That's far less money, dramatically less money, but yet the educational value is greater than if I were to decide, oh, hey, at my age, I want to take on $80,000 worth of debt in order to pursue some very specific, degree, because let's face it, most of the degrees are a shortcut for employers to know that you're credentialed.
That's
right.
Totally,
and it's a net.
Yeah.
And so you could still receive the benefit of the actual education without then having to fund a massive bureaucracy. I mean, one of the things that is the net benefit maybe to COVID is discovering that so much of the university bureaucracy that is funded by government-backed student loans may not, in fact, all be necessary to achieve the outcome, which is a broader education for society. I was about to say kids, but young adults.
Young adults, you're right. Chuck says, availability credit drives up prices, right? So again, you could, because you're making money cheap, the demand for the product is going to go up, and demand necessarily dictates that prices go up. So,
especially in a case where, again, you cannot discharge that debt. So it's one thing, like even with, and Chuck, I agree, but it's one thing even with autos, right? At the end of the day, like you make a whole bunch of bad decisions, then you can go bankrupt and the auto loan is not going to be repaid. Now that's not a good thing, but it makes the person on the lending side more judicious about your ability to repay.
That's exactly right.
Law of unintended consequences. The government said, hey, who's really going to give a kid a student loan? Because there's a ton of risk there. So if we back these, then we could spread that across not just higher income individuals, right? That was the intent. Was they said, okay, college, we're becoming just this really this two-tiered system, and so we want to distribute education more broadly. So they backed these loans. It's gone into reverse. There's no cap and there's no discharge. And right, to me, that's the biggest issue, is the inability to discharge in bankruptcy. And the reason is because now lenders know that they can inflate prices, schools can inflate prices, right? And that money train is just going to keep on going. It's not the fact that you can have government-backed, loans. It's the fact that they can't be discharged in bankruptcy that I find the most problematic.
Totally. We got one here from Graeson. What are some ways limited government strategies can benefit primary education students? So this is actually a good one, and I touched on this a little bit. I don't think that the No Child Left Behind Act has been what it was intended to be, and there's a whole lot of standardized testing, and at the highest level, the picture we're starting to see is that the original milestones or markers of success that the program had were not quite as cut and dried as they thought. In other words, it wasn't so easy to attribute any gains or successes directly to the No Child Left Behind Act. And there's often discussion that some of the statistics were cherry picked for a reason. I think that whatever funding goes into No Child Left Behind, from a limited government perspective, just philosophically in general, I believe that the resources we have in federal government should be used to create incentives to drive behaviors at the lowest levels. What I don't want to see are our awesome teachers here in Texas who've worked hard and are creative problem solvers in their classrooms. I don't want to see them have 60% of their schedule dictated and mandated. I'd rather that we enable them to tailor education to students, that more so than creating a bunch of crazy standardized testing. So from where I sit, that's kind of a limited government way. It's less about let's push the mandates down and more about let them figure out what they need. What do you think, Matt? Any other kind of quick bullet points?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, empowering teachers is the most important thing you can do in a local community, in my mind, because again, I mean, like you said, the whole principle, it's not just limited government, it's also about decentralized government, where the government closest to the end user is typically the most effective.
There you go.
So instead of the federal government coming down to the state, government, then going down to the local ISDs, I think more power should be given to the local ISDs who have a better understanding of their community and can make the most impact than having, again, some bureaucrat far removed and unable to give the best decisions for that specific locale. I mean, this district here is a prime example. You've got rural areas, you've got suburban areas. Those ISDs know their kids, and those teachers know their kids the best. They should be the most empowered in my mind.
I couldn't agree more. That whole limited government and pushing the power down to the lowest level where people can control it, that's the most effective and efficient use of resources and of governance. Kevin puts this really cool stat up here talking about skilled trades. Thanks for putting that up there, Kevin. I know where that came from, and that kind of tees up, kind of rounding this discussion out a little bit. That statistic about the trades is from wearegenerationt.org, which is a really neat foundation put together, sponsored by Lowe's Home Improvement. You can learn about different skilled trades and search for jobs on there, as well as just kind of an education about what things are out there. Hey, how much money could I make doing a insert job here, HVAC technician? Similarly, Mike Rowe has MikeRoweWorksFoundation.org. Mike Rowe from Dirty Jobs is a tremendous champion for skilled trades and labor, and his foundation does a lot with scholarships. What I'm trying to talk about here are alternatives to going straight to a four-year school. Does that mean that after a couple of years of doing these things, you decide you want a degree? Absolutely. Then you've got more focus and you've got a little more maturity. Somebody told me a long time ago, probably when I was returning back to Texas A&M at the age of 29, that education is wasted on young minds. And I was like, I couldn't agree more. That's exactly my experience in life. And when I went back at 29, I was getting 4.0s and straight A's. So the last thing I want to talk about as far as alternatives to four-year degree is serviceyear.org. General Stanley McChrystal started this, and it's a national drive, or it's a marketplace for ideas for a service year. So think about, maybe people have called it a gap year, a year after high school to just kind of do something different and figure stuff out. Serviceyear.org is about that. And General McChrystal, he wants people to change the way we talk in society. Instead of saying, where'd you go to college? It could be, where'd you do your service year? And that could be military, like you and I did. It could be Peace Corps. It could be government service. It could be volunteer work. There's just a tremendous number of things. But I think that we societally should be pushing more programs like this of self-discovery and learning different ways through life, and less about the straight to college four-year degree. And finally, I want to just kind of wrap this up. And I'm going a little bit over, and that's okay, because it's all good discussion. But
because I talk
two of us, my friend. Why is it important to Northeast Texas? Look, one of my biggest things on my campaign has to do with holding China accountable, both for their inaction and cover-ups in the virus and their theft and the vast number of crimes they've committed. Look, we have made the short-term trade of the almighty dollar to move manufacturing to China to save a few bucks. And now we're reaping the consequences of that, to where we're so interwoven with them, it's hard to separate. But what we need to continue doing, and what I know a lot of folks and President Trump have been trying to do, is bring manufacturing back to the US. Specifically, we would prefer Northeast Texas. That does a couple of things. Number one, we're going to reduce our reliance on China, which is the right thing to do. Number two, obviously, we're going to create jobs in Northeast Texas and stimulate the economy. But three, we would have other options. So between the skilled trade organizations and bringing manufacturing back to Northeast Texas, we'd have a tremendous amount of options for students who are wrapping up high school that doesn't require going off to a big city or going off to a four-year university. If we make it okay to work in trades and provide those jobs in manufacturing, then man, we've solved a lot of the problems that we have. That's about all I've got for today. I appreciate Matt. Thank you so much for coming on and offering your perspective. Always a tremendous help. I appreciate all the comments and feedback throughout and in advance. We are trying to set up a topic for the first week of August, and when we get some feedback from folks, we'll have another webinar. Anyway, thank you so much, and have a great day.
Thanks, man.